This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to Property Showcase, the podcast that brings you closer to the service providers that can inform your decisions about how you buy, manage and research top investment opportunities. Be informed and become a better investor with Property Showcase.
Hello everyone, Grace Ormsby here. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Property Showcase, where we give you the inside track of the tools, the people, the services that are going to give you the fast track when it comes to your property investment journey. And it is an absolute pleasure to be talking to someone from InvestorKit today, but someone I don't think many of you would have heard from, James Nelis. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Grace. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Good. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm pretty excited to be talking to you today because there's obviously a lot going on in the property market at the moment. Hard to be wading through all the information that we're getting. And we're going to be talking a little bit about interest rates, I believe, but we won't get there just yet. James, before we go into the crux of what we're going to be chatting about today, you have been a property investor yourself. When did you originally get started in the property game?
Yeah, so I bought my first property 10 years ago, coming up to that mark in 2014. And I probably made one of the number one errors that you shouldn't do as a property investor. And I bought in my local hometown about 1.5 k's from where I was living with my mum and dad.
I shouldn't laugh because so many people do the same thing. What was the instigator for choosing to do that?
Yeah, look, I shouldn't laugh either, but working in the space now. But for me, it's worked out into a bit of a positive light. But I was in a situation where I had a sum of money and I wanted to move out of home. And I originally decided that, I wanted to buy my first place and move into it, which I did. But I did have a bit of an investment lens on it when I bought. And the feedback or the coaching I got from my dad at the time was, just make sure it's a 4-bed, 2-bathroom, 2-garage, side access. You can't go wrong. And I took that advice and acquired and settled on that property with a few other sort of mistakes that went along with it as well.
Well, it can't have been that bad of a purchase in that it was a property and obviously standalone. You got a few things right there, James.
Correct.
Would have been a pretty interesting start to a property investment journey though.
Yeah, it was. And there was a few key takeaways from my end and something that I think is very useful for people to understand. And what I actually did was I cross-collateralized the loan with a parental guarantee from my parents, which at the time was just about me getting into the market and getting the borrowing. But I didn't really understand the dangers of doing something like that. And I really learnt that about 6 years later when I went and wanted to buy another property myself.
Interesting. Because a lot of people do go down that route now, especially given how expensive housing has become. A lot of parents are looking to be able to help their kids get on the property ladder. So it didn't work out. It did work out. What was kind of the issues there?
Yeah, so it worked out in the end, but it cost me a little bit of money at the time. So what I actually had to do was untangle the cross securitization from my parents. And my parents actually had to gift me half the property, which in the time required me to pay some extra stamp duties.
Okay, so learning curve.
Big learning curve. And what it did then, once we refinanced and actually separated and had itself on a standalone loan, it actually kept me out of the market for another 6 months, when at the time I was actually hoping to buy and move forward and actually start really to build and scale out a property portfolio at the time.
You obviously were quite interested in property investing at this point in time, James. It wasn't just to buy and have a place as much as it was to move out of home and have your own freedom. There was a bit of thought going on behind there. Was the plan always to use property investment as a vehicle for wealth creation?
Yeah, I think subconsciously, I think it definitely was. Like I said, when that first purchase, I had an investment lens on it and I always wanted to move out, which I had done about 2 years beforehand, before going to or realizing that mistake about the cross collateralization and trying to separate that from my parents. So I had moved out of it at the time and was renting it. And I had moved closer to the Brisbane city and was renting out and going along or fell into the rent vesting journey unknowingly at the time.
Wow. We could probably talk about this all day, but there's obviously been a shift for you from just property investing into the buyer's agent space and becoming someone who is able to do this for a living, which is a pretty exciting transition. Congratulations on taking the leap there. What really spurred that on for you?
Yeah, what sort of spurred that on for me was after I sort of had to wait another 6 months to acquire another purchase, I used a buyer's agent to settle on a property in Toowoomba. And I guess going through that process, it really opened my eyes to opportunities I could buy property outside of my local market. And I, at the time, had no capacity to be driving from Brisbane out to Toowoomba to inspect properties and that sort of thing. And it really opened my eyes in terms of a bit of a lack of awareness or what a buyer's agent could actually do for people. So I was really intrigued about that type of role and really saw the learnings I had from that purchase to add value to other people like myself.
Yeah, that's so cool. And there's obviously been a few years in that period in between there. Did it take a while for you to go, yeah, this is definitely what I'm going to be doing, or was it kind of an evolution?
A little bit of both. Like, I'm very big on learning. So I wanted to make sure I learn enough about the industry, learn enough about the type of role and where that could go, and make sure that sort of aligned with myself individually and my longer term goals as a person. And it did meet that. So yeah, it took some time, but yeah, continued on a learning journey and met a few people, networked, and it sort of got me to where I am today.
And now you're here on the Property Showcase with some amazing insights to be sharing, James. But I also feel like just your journey as a whole puts you in such good stead to be having these conversations with potential buyers out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to share mistakes or possible pitfalls that could come up if you do decide to go it alone, or help people navigate through similar situations. And I guess don't make the same mistakes that I made that cost me money, but might be able to save you in the shorter term and help you get to your goals as a buyer or as a person achieving a particular goal in a shorter amount of time.
I love that you're bringing up just how much money things can cost, especially when they go wrong, James. And I feel like that is kind of getting to the crux of what this episode is all about. Much of 2023 has been characterized by some pretty big interest rate increases that began last year. So many people across the country weren't expecting these to take place really until next year or the year after what information was handed down by the RBA Governor, Dr. Lowe at the time, that they just expected that downturn to be a bit longer. And obviously it hasn't been the case. And I'm sure there's a few people out there that just aren't really sure whether they should be getting into the market at this point in time, given we have seen, 13 interest rate hikes over the course of not even 18 months.
Yeah, barely 18 months.
How does that resonate with the kinds of conversations that you've been having with potential buyers out there at this point in time?
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversations we're having with people at the moment is not pausing your investment journey based off the rising interest rates. And I think for me, there's three important things that people should consider before making any purchase decision. And that's in a high rate environment and a low rate environment.
Okay. Can we unpack these then? Because really, it is at that point where so many people are probably quite debilitated in their thinking right now. It's so much harder to get a mortgage at the rates that people were seeing a couple of years ago, but we've seen the costs of housing explode in that time period as well. So it seems like there's still probably some opportunities out there when people know how to look for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you are coming across those opportunities, there's, like I said, the three important things that you need to consider before you make any of your purchase decisions in a high rate environment or a low rate environment. And the first one is your safety buffers. So it's really important to make sure you have them in check. And again, another lesson I went through is not adequately having your safety buffers in place before making your purchase.
So what is that safety buffer then? Like, is it a certain amount of cash? Is it equity to be pulling from somewhere? What is the best way to be defining a safety buffer and what it can do for you?
Yeah. So a general rule that we like to work with clients on is that if you're an aggressive investor, you need to have 6 months of outgoings worth of cash as a safety buffer. And that's got to include your loan repayments and your rental expenses.
So that's a fair bit of money for some people, James. What does that kind of, I guess, say, I'm going to put it out there, a $500,000 home. Is there a figure that you can kind of put on for what that safety buffer can look like?
Yeah, so I think it's just something that you need to calculate off in those repayments and sort of have yourself a spreadsheet so you know that exact number or that floor number you need to have as that safety buffer before you go in.
Yeah, okay. So it's something that people can be working out before they even, put the cash on the table to buy something, and probably should be doing rather than just thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's just something that that if you don't have that proper buffer in place, it might be important to sort of think twice about before you go and buy and factor that into your purchase costs that you have is the entry cost that you need from a deposit, stamps, buyer's agent fees, and also make sure you have enough money set aside for what that purchase is going to look like if you were looking at a 6-month deposit, or if you're going along a more conservative track, a 9 or 12 month buffer. But as I said, we think that 6 months is suitable enough to help you cover or mitigate any risks you're going to have when you're buying a property or to be able to hold it.
And what I like about what you're talking about here, James, is that you mentioned from the outset that these are things to be considering whether it is a high or a low interest rate environment. So while we are operating in a high interest rate environment at the moment, it's going to hold you in good stead, whether the rates do rise more in the future or whether they do fall.
100%. You're just safeguarding your property against any risks, more unexpected expenses that might be in relation to your property. And I think it's important as well that if you do have an unexpected expense in relation to your property, that you make sure you reallocate your savings and you're re-topping up those buffers so you're consistently at that line of baseline income or buffer amount that you need to feel safe and know that you're going to be able to hold your property portfolio for the longer term. That's
a really good point to make, because some people would probably use they've got that emergency money there and they would go to use it and then think, well, that's going to be the only thing that goes wrong with this property. That is never the case. Murphy's Law.
Absolutely not. And I think something important to highlight as well, Grace, is that buffer has got to be across each of your properties. So if you have 3 properties, you need to make sure you have 3 separate buffers, one for each property.
So good to know.
Yeah, good to know, because sometimes people think, I've got a buffer amount and they unallocate it for one property. And like I said, make sure you have that buffer amount when you're ready to go in for your deposit. So it's there sitting for you already. You're not having to then allocate more savings to try and rebuild it or kickstart that before you even make or once you've settled that purchase.
Some good insights there. Make sure you're writing down some notes for this conversation. You mentioned, James, that there were 3 things, and I believe we've done safety buffers. So we've got one out of the way, but there's 2 left to be talking about. What else do people need to be considering before they actually take the plunge and buy a property?
It's important to note is your cash flow. So even in those heightened interest rate environments, it doesn't just affect your loan repayments. It almost affects everything from our daily expenses and all the way through to business operational costs. So if those high interest rates have already affected those personal finances or your business cash flows, calculate what another investment's going to do to your own individual cash flow and the impacts of holding that when you go to make that purchase.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. And I imagine a lot of people probably have those buffers in place, but I'm guessing the cash flow probably gets left by the wayside just because people get so excited by the thought of putting something into action when it comes to creating a plan to buy a property.
100%. I think it's just making sure you're sitting down and you understand how that next acquisition, whilst you might have the deposit ready, you might have your buffer in place, but how's that potential shortfall, if there is one, how does that impact your lifestyle? And if it impacts you too much, well, maybe you might need to review some of your expenses and see what you might be able to alter. Or if you can't make those reductions or changes in your expenses, might be a good idea to hold off and wait until things potentially change in your personal circumstance before you then go and make that purchase.
What should then be the relationship between the safety buffer and the cash flow, James? Should they interact at all, or should you be keeping those kind of things completely separate?
I think you should potentially just make sure that, as we said, if that safety buffer does dip, are we able to re-top up that safety buffer to keep it at that, I guess, net zero amount that we're happy with? Because if it is eating too much into that safety buffer and we can't replace it, then we are starting to have a bit of an issue with our cash flow.
Yeah, cool. And the third thing, because we've now gone through safety buffers and we've gone through cash flow. There was a third thing there that I'm sure everyone is sitting on the edge of their seat to find out what it is.
And that's just in our portfolio building phase. So most of our investors, the portfolio building phase journey is around that 20 to 30 years. And something chatting with clients, it surprises them that it's only that first 5 to 10 years that you really should be actively buying and what we call that acquisition phase. So once you've hit your portfolio goal, it would be to stop buying, get your debt down and stabilize it so you can enjoy that compound growth of your portfolio. So if you're already outside of your acquisition phase, you may not even need to buy any more properties and maybe just pivot and focus on paying down some of your debt.
This is very much playing the long game, isn't it, James? Rather than, just trying to sort out what you're doing the next property at a time. There's clearly that interrelationship between all of these things, having the buffers and the cash flow and the build phase. Can you work out which one is the most important, or are they all just so integral to the process that you can't really have one without the others?
I think they're all key and integral to each other. And I guess probably what I would say is if you've got yourself good, solid cash buffers, you've got your cash flow in place and it isn't going to impact you too much and you're still in your acquisition phase, you should look to buy, whether it's in a high rate environment or a low rate environment.
There you go. I mean, especially given the crazy amounts of forecasts and predictions that have been coming through over the next year, no one does really know what is going to happen, but sounds like this is going to set people up for success, James, regardless of what does end up happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
How helpful would knowing those three things been to you when you started your property investment journey?
Massive. I think it's really important to understand these things, and that's where the buyer's agent can come in terms of that learning phase and help you understand and handhold you through the process. And that's what we do at InvestorKit.
Awesome, James. How can people reach out to you if they want to know a little bit more about these things to consider and how to properly put one of these plans in place?
Yeah, just head over to my website, jamesnelis.com.au, and then you'll be able to book in a consultation call with me and we can have a chat about your situation and how we might be able to help you.
Well, there you go. You heard it here first, James Nelis. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat. I feel like we're going to hear a lot more from you over the coming weeks, months, years, because you've clearly got a lot of insight going on from your lessons learned over the years and like an amazing career ahead of yourself as a buyer's agent. So keep it up.
Thanks, Grace.
To everyone who is listening, we hope you have enjoyed this episode. As James said, check him out on his website. We also have a link in the podcast copy here. If you have any questions, editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Until next time, stay safe and well wherever you're listening from. Bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.